The Stuarts were the infamous royal family who came onto the throne following the death of Queen Elizabeth I and the end of the Tudor dynasty. But the Stuarts themselves were as infamous as the Tudors. One king was brutally executed inside of his own kingdom, accused of being a traitor to his own people following the English Civil War. Another king was so scandalous that he fathered many illegitimate children, but not one could take the throne of the nation, and this plunged England into a succession crisis, and later further rebellion and bloodshed broke out. But some of the Stuart kings and queens had their coffins and tombs opened over the following centuries after their deaths, and some of these have been remarkably subjected to a horrific amount of desecration and destruction. But what is the story of the desecrated Stuart royal vaults? And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. One of the most captivating women of the 16th century was Mary, Queen of Scots. She had a very tumultuous love life, and she was married to the King of France that died young, and she also married a man who was blown up. Her third husband was the man suspected of killing her second, but inside the walls of a modest castle in England, Mary, Queen of Scots would be executed in brutal fashion. A headsman took her head off in a number of swings of his axe, following her death sentence for treason. Mary had been involved in a number of plots against the life of Queen Elizabeth I, and following the Babington plot, the Queen of England had had enough and finally signed her death warrant. But following her execution, Mary's body was not treated well and was originally buried nearby at Peterborough Cathedral. However, this was then dug up and moved to Westminster Abbey. But on a number of occasions, Mary's executed resting body was disinterred and was even broken into when it was placed in its final resting place. Mary, Queen of Scots, was not executed in one single strike of the axe. The first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head, and the second blow severed the neck except a small bit of sinew, which was then cut through using the executioner's axe. Her head was held aloft inside the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, and the executioner declared, "God save the Queen." Following this, her wig came loose, and her head then fell onto the floor. But after her execution, everything which was touched by her blood, including her clothing and even the executioner's block, was thrown into the fireplace of the great hall, to stop relic hunters obtaining relics from the dead Queen of Scotland. Mary's execution greatly distressed Queen Elizabeth I, and she even had one of her counsellors thrown inside the Tower of London. But Mary, Queen of Scots, before her death, had given strict instruction that after her death, she wanted to be buried in France, alongside her first husband. This was refused by Elizabeth I, and her body was then embalmed and was left inside a secure lead coffin inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle. Mary's body was left unburied and in a coffin which was sealed for a number of months, as a suitable location to bury her was not found. Eventually the authorities settled on Peterborough Cathedral, which was the closest cathedral to the execution site. Her entrails and heart were buried within Fotheringhay Castle's grounds, and then after 6 months Elizabeth I ordered her burial. Mary's request was denied, and the brutal register for Peterborough Cathedral for 1587 said, "The Queen of Scots was most sumptuously buried in ye Cathedral Church of Peterborough, the 1st day of August 1587, who was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle, the 8th of February before." Queen Elizabeth's household officers and heralds arrived in Peterborough in later July to choose the burial place, and they selected a site directly opposite Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII. A rich hearse was erected near the first steps of the choir, and the whole of the cathedral was decorated with black hangings. On the 30th of July, between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m, the body was brought from Fotheringhay by torchlight in a chariot hung with black velvet, adorned with Mary, Queen of Scots symbols. It was attended on by the Bishop and Dean of Peterborough, and many other officials along with members of Mary's household. The body was taken into the cathedral, and then it was laid into the vault. On the Monday afternoon, a group of lords and ladies arrived at the bishop's palace, which was hung in black, and then the following morning, members of the clergy and lords and ladies gathered in the cathedral for a sermon by the Bishop of Lincoln, who said that he hoped Mary was saved, despite having died a Catholic. Her officials and servants then broke their staves of office and placed them in Mary's grave, and then mourners had another huge feast, and everyone went home. A helmet, sword, and shield were then installed to hang above the tomb, but this was not what Mary wanted. But her tomb and grave would then be broken into. In 1603, following the death of Elizabeth I, Mary's son James succeeded onto the throne and became known as King James I. He was already the Scottish king, and he unionised the crowns. But 3 years after coming onto the throne, he began to plan for the reburial of his mother inside of Westminster Abbey. Plans took years to be drawn up, and Mary Queen of Scots would be reburied in 1612, with an extravagant tomb taking 6 years to complete. Her remains were then dug up from Peterborough Cathedral, and they were taken on the journey to Westminster Abbey in London. A royal warrant granted the burial, and this took place on the 11th of October. The King James I had erected a magnificent marble tomb for her on the south aisle of the Lady Chapel, under a fine white marble effigy, under a canopy. Her effigy showed her wearing a close-fitting coif, a laced ruff and long mantle. A crowned Scottish lion stands by her feet. She was buried in a chapel opposite Elizabeth I, but her tomb was slightly grander than Elizabeth's, a small dig that James I had against the Queen, who ordered his mother's execution. But Mary Queen of Scots' remains would be broken into yet again, and in 1867 Arthur P. Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, would oversee and order a search of her vault. The Dean of Westminster at the time was searching for the lost tomb of King James I, which was later found in the vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But at the time, they believed that the remains could have been found within the same vault of his mother, Mary Queen of Scots. After the exhumation and lifting of the tomb, Stanley found that Mary's lead coffin was along the north wall of the vault, but she was not alone. Shockingly, the vault contained a number of other burials too, meaning that over the years, Mary Queen of Scots' vault had been opened a number of times, with other members of the royal family being interred near to her. Mary was found beneath that of Lady Arabella, Stuart's coffin, and inside the vault was also Henry, the Prince of Wales, Anne Hyde, the Duchess of York, and the mother of 2 Stuart queens, Mary II and Anne, Elizabeth, the Winter Queen of Bohemia, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and also many children of James II were also held here. Interestingly, many of those inside this vault were descendants of the Stuarts, the very dynasty that Mary was the head of. Queen Anne and her surviving child, the Duke of Gloucester, were also found there. But throughout the centuries, Mary Queen of Scots, following her death, was disturbed a number of times. Following her brutal execution, she was disemboweled, and her remains were then buried inside the grounds of Fotheringhay Castle. Then her body was taken to the nearby Cathedral of Peterborough, before it was buried in a huge ceremony there, with a lot of respect. But around 25 years later, she was disinterred and dug up again at the request of her son, the then King of England and Scotland. She was then taken to Westminster Abbey, and the heart of religion in England, and was buried in a huge and ornate tomb befitting her status. Then, 200 years after this, her vault was disturbed as the officials inside of Westminster Abbey were searching for the remains of her son. Despite living a very captivating life, her final moments were chaotic, botched, and still today she is laid to rest in a place nowhere near where she wanted to be. Inside of Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh lies a burial vault, and this was once the royal vault. Today it is sealed by a large door, but it was where many kings of Scotland were interred following their deaths. Today Holyrood Abbey is a shell of its former self, and it was the place where kings and queens would come to worship. But this vault was broken into a number of times over the centuries. Inside of the vault was the remains of the second husband of Mary, Queen of Scots, the infamous Lord Darnley, a man who was obsessed with power, and he wished greatly for his wife to make him the King of Scotland and to rule alongside her. But Mary never granted Darnley this, and Henry Stuart, as he was known, became furious. He died under rather bizarre circumstances, but the location of his remains are a mystery, and it's believed that they were stolen from that very burial vault inside of Holyrood Abbey. But what is the story of opening the coffin of Mary, Queen of Scots' second husband? Darnley himself was the eldest surviving son of Matthew Stuart, the 4th Earl of Lennox, and he descended from Tudor royalty. His grandmother was Lady Margaret Tudor, the daughter of King Henry VII of England, and the widow of James IV, the King of Scotland. He was born in Leeds in Yorkshire in around 1545, and his upbringing was rather different. After the Wars of the Rough Wooing, Matthew Stuart sided with the English king, Henry VIII, and because of this the family estates were forfeited, and his father went to England to live in exile for 22 years. Henry knew he was from a high-profile family, and as a boy he received a good education, and he was said to have been a strong and skilled young man. He was close to the line of succession to the crown of England after Queen Elizabeth, but he was not as close to it as Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots at the time, had been living in France and returned to Scotland following the death of her first husband, the French King Francis II. Darnley's mother had for some time tried to facilitate a marriage and an agreement between her son and Mary, who was 4 years older than him. Following Francis's death, Darnley was sent to France to meet the widowed Queen of Scotland, and during their first meeting, nothing really occurred. When Darnley returned to Scotland to travel with his father, he and Mary grew closer. At first he was part of a large group of men who wished to try and take the Queen's hand in marriage. However, in the April of 1565, after being part of Mary's court for a short while, he became very sick. At Stirling Castle, he contracted measles, and Mary the Queen nursed him back to health, and when he recovered, the Queen had fallen head over heels in love with him. He was a tall and attractive man, and the marriage took place on the 29th of July, 1565, in the chapel of the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh. The match caused outrage between Mary and her advisers, including the influential John Knox, the religious reformer, and also James Stuart, the 1st Earl of Moray, Mary's half-brother. Queen Elizabeth of England also was furious with the marriage and ordered him and his father to return to England. They disobeyed this, and it's bizarre why Elizabeth was furious, as she even gave Darnley permission to travel to Scotland initially. Mary wished to marry Darnley quickly, and rushing this through, she didn't receive special permission to marry from the Pope, which was required, due to the fact they were related. Their marriage initially was happy, but shortly after Mary became pregnant in the autumn of 1565, and Darnley quickly became very annoyed with the fact he had been given the title of King Consort. This angered him greatly, as he wished not to just be a consort with no real legal power. He wished to be the King of the Scots outright, and with all the authority that a king should possess. He was not willing to sit in the shadows and act merely as an adviser. He believed, as he had royal blood, he should wield and possess more power than his wife, and because of this he grew incredibly dissenting. Mary soon learned that her new husband was arrogant and unreliable and very unpopular within her nobles and advisers. He also was known for being rather violent and physical, including hitting the Queen, which was made worse when he drank alcohol. Mary continued to refuse to appoint Darnley the successor to her if she died childless, and Darnley was furious. This rage was encapsulated by the murder of David Rizzio, the Queen's private secretary. On the 9th of March 1566, Darnley, along with a number of his friends and nobles, whilst the Queen was 6 months pregnant, brutally murdered her closest adviser. Some accused Mary of having an affair with the flamboyant David Rizzio, and rumours were around court that Rizzio was the child of the heir to the throne. He was stabbed 56 times, and he left to die all whilst the Queen was screaming. It was clear that Darnley was behind the murder, and Mary could no longer trust her husband, and he was hated even more. When their son, the future James VI of Scotland and James I of England, the successor to the throne, was in place, Darnley's son, the royal couple continued to have marriage issues. Darnley began to drink heavier and alienated people, and was still obsessed with the fact he believed he should be the king outright. However, within a year of the murder of David Rizzio, Lord Darnley himself would find himself dead in bizarre and incredible circumstances. At the start of 1567, Darnley was taken ill in Glasgow from suspected syphilis, which he picked up possibly from visiting prostitutes. Mary went to see him, and they returned to Edinburgh, and Darnley was taken to Provost House and was attached to a church called Kirk O'Field, just inside the walls of the city. The house was owned by Robert Balfour, whose brother was a counsellor of the Queen's. He was taken there to recover, and at the time, because no one knew what caused his illness, he was left there to recover to ensure he did not come into contact with the baby son, the future king. On the 9th of February, Mary visited her husband in the evening, and then returned to the palace of Holyrood House. However, what happened next was unbelievable. In the early hours of the 10th of February, the house exploded and was destroyed whilst the Queen was at Holyrood celebrating a wedding. The house was decimated, and the partially clothed body of Lord Darnley and his servant were found nearby in an orchard. It was said that the explosion was a force that destroyed the whole lodgings, and there is nothing left which is not ruined. However, their bodies didn't tell a story that they died in the explosion. The two bodies showed signs of strangulation, and that they were, in fact, unharmed by the explosion. Because of this, it was clear that Darnley was murdered before the explosion occurred. Statements obtained the next day confirmed strange behaviour near the lodgings. One witness stated how she was looking out of her window and heard 13 men pass nearby, and then there was a huge explosion, and she accused these men of being traitors and evil. Another woman who lived opposite said how she was in bed when she heard the explosion, and when she ran to the door she saw 11 men. She grabbed one to ask what happened, and no answer was given. A later memoir would state how Darnley was taken out of the house shortly before the explosion, and was strangled to death in the stable, with a serviette in his mouth. He was then left under a tree. Rewards were offered for information, but suspicion fell upon the Queen herself. Other accounts of Darnley's murder offered slightly different stories. One historian states how Darnley had been strangled before the explosion, and it's likely that he saw the commotion outside with the conspirators, and along with his servant fled the house, and they were found in the garden. It's possible they escaped using a rope from the first-floor window, as this was also found nearby, and when they were intercepted they were murdered with the explosion, an attempt to cover up the murder. However, the men got out of the house, which confirmed they had died. Mary observed 40 days of mourning for her husband. However, suspicion began to arise. But Mary would then be imprisoned by the man who she would then marry next, her third husband, James Hepburn. But following his death, Lord Darnley was buried inside of the royal vault in Holyrood Abbey in 1567. He was laid to rest alongside the bodies of a number of kings, including King David II and King James II, as well as King James V, the father of his wife, Mary Queen of Scots. However, he would not be laid to rest for eternity. In 1668, an angry mob stormed into Holyrood Abbey, and they then broke into the royal vault and caused a significant amount of damage, and they stole many of the bones. A further incursion into the burial vault took place into the 18th century, as another angry mob broke into it. But because of this, the remains of Lord Darnley and his corpse may have been stolen or tampered with, but it's known for certain that his skull was taken and was removed from the burial vault. The skull of Lord Darnley went missing for many years, and in 1928 a research paper was produced about the possible location of it, and in this it was claimed that the skull was held inside the Royal College of Surgeons Museum in Edinburgh. But then in 2016 a request was made to try and identify the skull in the university's collection, which could have been the stolen skull of Henry Stuart, the second husband of Mary, Queen of Scots. The Royal College of Surgeons skull, as well as the one inside of the university, were analysed and compared, and it was confirmed that the university skull could not be the one. However, the one inside of the Royal College of Surgeons could possibly be. From this, a historian facial reconstruction was produced, and it showed that the skull belonged to a man who held an incredible likeness and similarity to the portraits of Lord Darnley, and this brought an end to the mystery as to where Darnley's skull was. It's been considered that the skull of Darnley could at one point in the future been returned to the royal burial vault, or parts of it. It had been destroyed in part due to the Blitz, so it had to be reconstructed, but Lord Darnley was a man who was hated inside of the Scottish court by many. He was a man obsessed with power, and he treated his wife Mary, Queen of Scots, poorly towards the end of his life. One of the most crazy executions in English history saw the King, Charles I, on the 30th of January 1649, be taken to the executioner's scaffold, which had been created on Whitehall. He was the man who had plunged his country into the deadliest civil war ever fought on English soil, and he has been condemned by Parliament and figures such as Oliver Cromwell. But the king was met by an anonymous executioner and an axeman who in one swing of the axe took the king's head from his shoulders. However, as the king's remains were gathered up, there was a question as to what to do with the body of Charles I, as Parliament were worried that it would become a royalist relic and be venerated by those who wanted to oppose the new political structure in England. But Charles I was buried in secret, alongside one of the most controversial and notorious kings of England, Henry VIII. But 200 years after his execution, his coffin was broken into. King Charles I's execution was a shocking event in which he was taken under armed escort to the Palace of Whitehall, next to where he would be executed. He was escorted onto the scaffold, and his public were looking on, and he was taken through a window of the banqueting house. Charles made a speech to the crowd that day which was difficult to hear, and he said, "An unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me. But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in the government. That is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. Before finishing, I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." His words were ominous, and were those of a man who believed his time on earth was up, but Charles would then be given himself over to the executioner at around 2 p.m. He then lowered himself onto the block after uttering a prayer, and he told the executioner he was ready by stretching his arms out as the blow from the axe then came crashing down. The king lost his head, and the crowd that day sighed, as they were not necessarily excited with what they saw. Many believed that Charles I was sent by God to rule over them, and that now they would be punished. The executioner did show the king's head to the crowd, but his remains were then gathered together and were placed in a coffin ready for burial. After the execution, the remains of Charles were then embalmed, and during this the royal physicians and doctors sewed the head of the Stuart monarch back on. But there was much debate as to where to bury the lead-lined coffin and the body of the executed king. Parliament began to debate this, and they believed it was too much of a risk to bury the king inside of central London, where it could be dug up, and they did not want to allow Charles, the
precedent of being buried alongside other kings and queens in Westminster Abbey. Parliament feared retribution and revenge for what they had done to Charles, and they did not want his burial site to become a shrine, but they then came to the conclusion to bury Charles inside of Windsor Castle, and specifically St George's Chapel, but this would be done in secret. It was said that this was a quieter place to bury the king, but the royal vaults would become much busier in the centuries after. In the middle of the night, on the 9th of February 1649, the coffin of Charles I was taken quietly from central London to Windsor, and he was then buried inside of the same vault as King Henry VIII, who was also laid to rest in a purpose-built vault alongside his third wife, Jane Seymour. This was said to have been a rather secretive space. There were plans for Charles II, the executed king's son, to bury his father in a grand mausoleum inside of Hyde Park, but this never occurred, and still today Charles is laid to rest in this vault with Henry VIII, two brutal kings laying side by side. However, for centuries it was believed that Charles's coffin had been lost to time, and thus his remains were missing. But the burial vault containing his body was actually broken into during building work in 1813, and the builders also found the remains of a child's coffin, this being the child of Queen Anne that tragically died. But Henry VIII's coffin was said to have been in a very poor state, as it had been broken, and there were even stories of people breaking into his coffin and stealing his bones. But Charles's coffin was found next to Henry, and the man who was investigating this was Sir Henry Halford, and he opened Charles's coffin on the 1st of April 1813 to confirm that this was in fact the lost body of the executed Stuart monarch. He did this in front of the Prince Regent, the future George IV, but he noticed when he broke into the coffin that Charles's head, which had come loose from his body. As mentioned, his head was sewn back on, but the thread must have decayed in the years since. On top of the coffin was an inscription that said King Charles 1649, and it was noted that the body of Charles I had been prepared in a different way. It was wrapped in a number of layers of cerecloth, which helped preserve it well, and it was so well wrapped that Halford had to take the body out of the coffin to unwrap it. He then wrote that at length the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The complexion of the skin of it was dark and discoloured. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of the nose was gone, but the left eye, in the first moment of exposure, was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately. And the pointed beard, so characteristic of the period of the reign of King Charles, was perfect. The shape of the face was a long oval. Many of the teeth remained, and the left ear, in consequence of the interposition of the uncut matter between it and cerecloth, was found entire. It was difficult at this moment to withhold a declaration that, notwithstanding its disfigurement, the countenance did bear a strong resemblance to the coins, the busts, and especially to the pictures of King Charles I by Van Dyck, by which it had been made familiar to us. It's true that the minds of the spectators of this interesting sight were well prepared to receive this impression, but it is also certain that such a facility of belief had been occasioned by the simplicity and truth of Mr. Herbert's narrative, every part of which had been confirmed by the investigation so far as it had advanced, and it will not be denied that the shape of the face, the forehead and eye, the beard, and the most important features by which resemblance is determined. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachments which confined it, it was found to be loose, and without any difficulty was taken up and held to view. It was quite wet, and gave a greenish-red tinge to paper and to linen when touched it. The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect, and had a remarkably fresh appearance, the pores of the skin being more distinct as they usually are when soaked in moisture, and the tendons and ligaments of the neck were of considerable substance and firmness. The hair was thick at the back part of the head, and in appearance nearly black. A portion of it, which has since been cleaned and dried, is of a beautiful dark brown colour. That of the beard was a redder brown. On the back part of the head it was more than an inch in length, and had probably been cut so short for the convenience of the executioner, or perhaps by the piety of friends soon after death, in order to furnish memorials of the unhappy king. This was a huge achievement for Sir Henry Halford. He had found the remains of the executed King of England, and he even held up the head and confirmed it was Charles without any doubt. He said that the muscles of the neck had evidently retracted themselves considerably, and the fourth cervical vertebra was found to be cut through its substance transversely, leaving the surface of the divided portions perfectly smooth, and even an appearance which could have been produced by a heavy blow inflicted with a very sharp instrument. This added further evidence that it was the king, as it confirmed that he had lost his head by a sharp weapon, such as an axe. But after it was said, following the examination of the head, which served every purpose in view, and without examining the body below the neck, it was immediately restored to its situation. The coffin was soldered up again, and the vault closed. This was the last time that the vault of the King Charles I, and also Henry VIII, was opened at all, and Charles was a man who led his nation into civil war, and some believed it was justified what happened to him on that cold January morning on the scaffold in 1649. But in the years after, his remains were unwrapped and his coffin was broken into in front of a crowd of shocked onlookers, including the future king.
One of the most brutal executions to have ever been performed in England was that of James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth. He was a rebel who would be taken to the Tower Hill for his execution in front of a huge crowd during the reign of James II. But he was executed by a man who has gone down in history for his botching executions, Jack Ketch. Monmouth was the son of King Charles II, and as he was illegitimate, he was not in the line of succession, but he believed that he was the rightful king. But Jack Ketch's actions with his axe almost caused a riot as he struggled to take Monmouth's head from his body. However, he was exhumed at one point with his coffin opened, and there were claims that his head was sewn back on so that a portrait could be painted of him. But there was also another probability that he was dug up again inside the Tower of London's chapel, where he had been laid to rest. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was the son of Charles II and Lucy Walter, and he was a skilled military commander, and he was also a Knight of the Garter. In the eyes of many, he should have been the heir to the throne. But after the death of his father, his uncle James II came onto the throne. James was not the most well-liked because of his Catholic sympathies and beliefs, and Monmouth was a very powerful military leader, and he was very well respected. He went into exile in the Netherlands, but Monmouth would later rise up. He funded a rebellion by selling a lot of his possessions so that ships could be made, and he wanted to take England and the English crown for himself. James II heard of the plot and the invasion, and his royalist forces met Monmouth's rebellion head-on in the Battle of Sedgemoor. It did not take much for Monmouth to be crushed, and he then fled the battlefield, but he was caught hiding in a ditch. Quickly, Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against him, sentencing him to death for being a traitor. He was given no trial, and it was stated that James, the Duke of Monmouth, has in a hostile manner invaded the kingdom, and the said Duke of Monmouth be convicted and attainted of high treason, and that he suffer pained of death. He was sent to the Tower of London to wait for his execution, and Monmouth knew that he was ready for his execution, and on the 15th of July 1685 he was informed that his execution was going to take place, so he dressed himself in clean stockings, a fresh shirt and lace scarf, and he also wore a grey suit and a long periwig. He was dressed in his finest clothes, and he was visited by his wife and their children as they said goodbye to him. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was then walked out of the Tower of London on the short stroll north by the guards of the Tower to Tower Hill, where the executioner was waiting for him. There was a large crowd also gathered to see his execution, and there was some fear of sympathy for him, as he was a rather well-liked figure, and the king, well, he was not. But the executioner waiting for him on the scaffold was Jack Ketch, the man who worked in London, taking the heads of many criminals. The scaffold had been covered in mourning cloth, such was his status, and the king's guard also guarded the wooden platform to ensure that he could not be rescued or escape. Ketch, the executioner, is considered one of the worst and most brutal in history, and he had previous in making a mess of executions with an axe. Monmouth told Ketch to do your work well, and he said, "Here are 6 guineas for you. Pray you do your business well. Do not serve me as you did my Lord Russell. I have heard you struck him 3 or 4 times. If you give me 2 strokes, I promise I will not stir." He was talking to the executioner about his former mistakes and botches, and this may have thrown Ketch's composure and made him angry and made him lose his concentration. He also tried to touch the axe that would take his head, and he complained that this instrument was not sharp enough to cut his head off. He was told by Ketch that this would work, but Monmouth then put his head on the block. The first swing of the axe struck Monmouth's neck, but he caught the side of it and missed, and Scott then looked up at the executioner in shock. The second swing took a bigger chunk from Monmouth's neck, and the third completely missed. Ketch screamed, "God damn me, I can do no more. My herd failed me. I cannot do it." The executioner seemed to give up, with Monmouth bleeding, but not dead. And the crowd threatened to kill him if he did not put Monmouth out of his misery and continue. He had to be forced to do this by officials and guards, and he swung his axe a further 3 times onto Monmouth's neck, and this then killed him. But his head was still attached to his body. He then took out a butcher's knife and cut through Monmouth's neck, before it then fell to the floor. He held up Monmouth's head and uttered the words, showing the traitor's head to the crowd, but there were boos, and the crowd rushed to grab the executioner, who was then escorted away by guards. After this, the body of James Scott was taken into the walls of the Tower of London, as was his head. It would not be placed above Tower Bridge, and he was to be buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the Tower's chapel. But there was a legend that emerged regarding his remains and body. That is, following his execution, it was realised that no official portrait of Monmouth existed and had been painted, and because of this his body was exhumed and the coffin opened. Royal physicians then allegedly stitched Monmouth's head back onto his body, and then a portrait needed to be painted. His body was sat for a portrait for hours, some time after his death. One of the paintings of him shows him with his eyes closed, almost sleeping. There is a probability and certain possibility that James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was yet again exhumed and dug up. In the reign of Queen Victoria, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula needed a significant amount of restoration. Victoria was appalled that this was the burial place of 3 queens, and she ordered building work to be done. With this, the floor in particular needed replacing, and close to the high altar there were some very significant remains found. Anne Boleyn, the executed second wife of Henry VIII, was discovered, as was her brother George Boleyn, who lost his head on Tower Hill. Also discovered were the remains of other Tudor figures who were executed, but much of the investigation focused around Anne Boleyn and the discovery of her body. But the remains of James Scott, because they were buried closest to the altar, must have also been found. Because of his status, his remains were later reburied by the high altar, and the closest to it as he was the son of the Stuart King Charles II. But his remains would have been analysed by a committee of experts, and then they were placed inside of a new lead casket with an engraving showing who they belonged to. They were later then, around 6 months later, placed back into the ground, and today James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, the man who suffered such a brutal and botched execution, lies at rest inside the Tower of London's chapel. The fact he is closest to the altar indicates his status as one with specific royal blood. But he lies in front of Anne Boleyn and Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector of England, during the reign of Edward VI, who also lost his head. His interment is listed as number 15, meaning he was the final one to be placed inside of his grave of those high-profile people who died on Tower Hill or Tower Green, or within the walls of the tower itself. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, may have had his coffin opened numerous times also, due to the painting legend about him not having his portrait done whilst he was alive. This leads to the probability that in death his remains were tampered with a lot.